Prosimy o zajmowanie miejsc. Proszę Państwa.
I would like to ask you to take your seats, and ladies and gentlemen, we are moving on to the almost last point of our agenda, which is a workshop, measures at farm level to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from EU agriculture. It was prepared by the Policy Department B. This workshop has been organized at the request of our committee, so we would like to thank you for preparing this workshop. We'd like to thank the Policy Department B. As we found out, climate change is a very frequent topic which often returns in its many aspects on the EU level, in the Parliament. It is also a major challenge for European agriculture, which we will have to face in the coming years. Of course, we have high expectations here. Today, we have invited experts, specialists, whom I would like to invite. I would like to invite all three of them. Mr. Jordi Domingo, Mr. Nicolas Métayer, and Madame Sylvain Pellerin, or Mr. Pellerin. I give you the floor. I suppose you will settle between you who will speak first. As far as I can see, I think the floor goes to Mr. Domingo. So I will give you the floor, and of course we would like to ask you to be relatively brief, because sometimes the experts tend to speak for an hour, but this is not the case in our committee. I give you the floor.
Bien, en primer lugar, muchas gracias.
First of all, thank you very much to the European Parliament for the invitation to tell you about the results of our work. The study that we're presenting to you, that is in front of you as well, is intending an objective and comprehensible analysis of mitigation targets at farm level. We also hope to facilitate decisions to be taken by European and national authorities about the new CAP reform and the fight against climate change. That being so, we are aware that successive CAP reforms over history have been characterized by meeting important environmental challenges, and this reform that we're talking about this afternoon is an opportunity for mitigating climate change. However, as I'll be explaining over the next few minutes, although it is possible to include measures with a significant mitigation potential, both under Pillar 1 and under Pillar 2, the final impact of those measures is still uncertain, and it depends on whether the measures proposed in this report are finally developed under the conditions described or not, and it also depends on whether the Member States make the effort to include them, particularly in the second pillar. The flexibility that has been given to the Member States is going to be key for us to see whether it is an advantage or a disadvantage in terms of the fight against climate change. This report is based in particular on the results of a LIFE project, which was structured in the way that you can see here. 5 partners from 4 different European Union countries taking part and aiming to identify mitigation measures at farm level which are the most effective. To do that, we collected and looked at the different instruments, the different evaluation instruments available in the European Union. So we worked out in practical applied terms, looking at real data and looking at more than 120 actual farms covering a wide range of different productive systems. In the diagram here for identifying emissions. What you're doing is assessing both direct energy consumption, indirect energy consumption, and greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see all that on this slide. So all emissions following, of course, international standards and methods. Here you can see the countries involved. 4 of the biggest farm economies in the European Union. And here you can see the diversity of productive systems that we were working on. And we stress that this is applied work. Over 3 years, we followed the farmers, or the owners of these farms, doing an analysis and a stock taking of their progress in terms of mitigation through the seasons. So the measures were set up first of all, and then we worked out how successful they were, what the results were. And ultimately, we analyzed all of these results and ended up with some 12 measures which can be put together, which can be grouped in the way that's there on the slide. You can have agronomic measures, you can have mitigation measures which apply to livestock, you can have measures that apply to energy, and then there's a 4th axis, what we are calling low-carbon agri-environment measures, which is a flexible measure so that farmers can carry out the arrangements which are best in line with their own possibilities and their own limitations, or just are the measures that they're actually prepared to carry out on their own farms. In the study in front of you, we also have advanced somewhat from what the project results are, because for each of the measures on the previous slide, we have a technical description, and we set up some technical targets. On the basis of those technical targets, we then identify the productive systems that would be covered by that particular measure and the potential reduction in greenhouse gas emissions at European level from each of these measures. And we also have tried to identify the environmental synergies that may arise from applying these mitigation measures, which are important. And then another thing that Parliament asked us to do was to explain which instruments in the new CAP reform were the best ones to cover these measures. And we were also asked to propose further alternative measures. And lastly, we look at the difficulty for farmers in executing these measures, and we look at how easy it is for the national authorities or European authorities to follow up, to check on the implementation of these mitigation measures. And we also look at the costs and main limitations of the mitigation measures. From all of these data, what we can get to is a priority list for the mitigation measures. And there are basically 3 important decisions underlying that list. First of all, how far-reaching the measures are on each farm. Secondly, how much they cost. And thirdly, how difficult it is for farmers to carry them through. This table here, which we imagine you won't be able to read on the screens, gives you a summary of all the work that we've done across all of these measures. As you can see, perhaps for each measure, we have the potential, the target, and the other criteria I described. I'll go quickly through these different measures then. First of all, the agronomic measures. The first one that we mention is nitrogen balance or nitrogen stock taking at farm level. So looking at how much mineral nitrogen there is in each farm. And we have a target. And above all, we're explaining that this is post-harvest, not pre-harvest, that you're supposed to be doing this assessment, which we reckon is not so useful pre-harvest. Secondly, we have the introduction of legumes on arable land and on grazing land. Thirdly, the conservation measure, stress conservation agriculture, which is not just a matter of conserving direct seeding machinery, but it's also things like direct planting, long rotations, and vegetable and green cover. If you do a conservation agriculture simply by keeping direct seeding, direct planting machinery, then you're losing a lot of the potential for mitigation. Lastly, under agronomic measures, we have cover crops, which includes both intermediate crops and the so-called catch crops. Now, as regards to livestock, we have some mitigation for manure storage in terms of spreading it, and we have something about biogas at farm level. Once again, stressing the importance of this measure with priority for using animal waste, not energy crops. As regards the energy measures that we propose, we have the replacement of diesel fuel or oil fuel by biomass. We have photovoltaic use. We have reduction in fuel consumption on the basis of a number of things, but above all, using the French experiments with trial banks of tractors. And lastly, electricity reduction based above all on this is basically for dairy farms. And lastly, we're proposing an agro-environmental measure, which we're calling low-carbon agriculture, based on the practical experience of the project, which shows that if you give farmers a closed list of mitigation possibilities, they're going to have trouble executing them, either for technical shortcomings or economic difficulties or because of a personal decision. The best thing is therefore to give them a long list of possible measures within a framework, a working framework. That way at least some of these measures will be progressively implemented. I'd like to give the floor now to my colleague who will concentrate now on this last measure.
Oui, bonjour à tous. Donc je vais continuer par vous.
Good afternoon. If I may, I would like to now take this opportunity to give you a couple of tangible examples that we used in this program. You've got some slides here which focus, for instance, on oranges and mandarins produced in Valencia, in the Valencia region of Spain. I think it gives you a visual idea of the kind of diversity in terms of results, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. If you look on the left there, for instance, you've got that axis, and then towards the right, towards the bottom, you find another indicator, which is climate efficiency. In other words, the quantity produced of greenhouse gases. If you look at emissions per hectare, you'll see that for the same land area, for the same territory, same production, you've got different farms, and according to their farming practices and the systems that have been put in place, your impact might range from 1 to 5 in terms of GHG emissions per hectare, so a range of 1 to 5. These are evaluations. You'll see, in fact, the blue areas on this graph. At the beginning of the programme, we suggested that farmers adopt certain plans, different ones, fairly broad-reaching or far-reaching measures, and there were discussions, sometimes even obstacles, maybe technical ones or maybe financial ones. But anyway, measures were implemented, and thanks to the green arrow you see here, you can actually visualize the kind of progress that was made with regard to these actions, one or several actions. And as you can see, sometimes the reduction in GHG emissions can be quite sizable thanks to these action plans put in place. Now, these are the different actions that were implemented at farm level. Of course, there's a great deal of variety, and obviously it will always depend on the kind of systems that you have in place. First table here, you've got oranges, orange production. You can use various measures. You can, for instance, look at nitrogen irrigation. You can look at cover crops as well, so the nitrogen balanced cover crops, or indeed irrigation sensors, and that's with a view to diminishing the quantity of water used per hectare. All will depend on the systems used. I mean, with orange production you have 3 different types of systems. The drip irrigation, surface irrigation, or other types of farming, such as organic farming. Now, the levers for action are not always the same, depending on the circumstances, but if you take the last line in this table, that's the reduction potential, GHG, or carbon storage, you'll see there that you can actually attain some sizable reductions on these farms. I mean, it could be 10%, or you can even double the carbon storage compared to the initial situation at the outset. Then, another example from Germany. This was another farm. They were specialized in apple production, so a different set of circumstances, different soil, different land, again, different measures that were implemented. These had to do with fuel consumption, trying to reduce energy consumption and using cooling systems as well for the storage of apples. And once again, thanks to these different measures, the mitigation potential for GHG was quite sizable, as you can see here. Then another case study. We had perennial crops, and here we're going to use another example for a larger holding, and you can again see the kinds of levers for action that can be used for arable crops. This is in fact an example taken from the south of France for arable crops in a slopey area, very slopey area, arable crops, and in this kind of situation you have erosion as a major challenge. Now, generally speaking, we're talking about tilling of land, and we're talking about also rotation of 2 or 3 different crops. And there's a rotation that takes place, but also erosion, like I said. Now, with this particular holding, it was decided that there would be an alternation or a rotation of different crops, that we would lengthen the time frames, diversify the species, and in addition to that, our intention was to try to limit erosion, soil erosion, by integrating plant cover wherever possible, particularly for interculture, where that is an important factor in the equation. Various evaluations have been carried out on these farms. There was a kind of diagnosis, if you like, using a specific tool to give you the results. If you look at the left there, top left, you've got the energy profile of the farm, which gives you a very clear idea of the issues that have to be dealt with in terms of energy. For instance, reducing fuel consumption, that's one thing, fertilizers. And then on the right, you've got GHG emissions, and you've also got the carbon storage variations. Then, towards the bottom of the slide, you can see the various measures, combined measures. In fact, this farm, in a way, brings together all the different elements that you would find in conservation farming. For instance, direct seeding, cover crops, the introduction, longer rotation periods, including leguminous plants. And as you can see, for each of these actions, there is a clear impact. There is a reduction and mitigation impact each time round, and GHG reduction in particular. So that particular farm today is consuming 30% less energy than the average for this type of farm. And in terms of GHG, again, 30% below what you'll find, generally speaking, for these types of farms in this kind of sector. And over the course of a decade, all of these actions have allowed us to double the organic matter and the carbon also stored in the soil. Depending on your agricultural system, whether you're talking about perennial crops, whether you're talking about arable crops, whether you're talking about, indeed, livestock. We're not going to be talking about that this time round, but you have some examples in the report if you want to have a look. Depending on your circumstances, you can actually achieve mitigation anything between 10 and 40%. Again, depending on your circumstances. You have to remember that the baseline, the starting point is very different from case to case, of course. Now, in terms of our approaches, I think it's very, very useful to carry out an energy assessment and also a GHG assessment, and we can do this using a tool, an assessment tool, which gives you the baseline, like I said, the point of departure, and then together with the farmer you can agree on the best possible course of action to try to reduce GHG emissions. Now, there is a tool that was developed within the context of this programme, but of course there are other initiatives around Europe. In particular, there's the DG Environment programme together with JRC. With JRC, they've also developed a carbon calculator. And in fact, there's a link here. If you want to download it, this carbon calculator, then you can do so. You can do so through our report. And there are other initiatives taken in our various member states, and they all aim to assess GHG emissions and what we can achieve. All will depend, of course, on the parameters and on the efficiency of these different tools. But I would argue that these tools are very, very useful because it gives you the baseline, it gives you a premise for discussing these matters with the farmer to see how you can, together with him, in future reduce GHG emissions. Now, another slide. Here you've got, if you like, an overview of the different measures that were analysed in the context of our report. We've tried to sort of create a list of priorities. In fact, we've assessed them according to cost. That's what you'll find there on the left. The one at the top of the list is neutral in terms of cost, or negative even. It means that you can actually derive some financial benefit for the farmer. And then also, as you go down the left-hand column, you'll see the costs are gradually increased, up and up. Then there's a second indicator, which I think is of interest to you, the difficulty for farmers, so technical difficulties that they might encounter in situ, and depending on the level of difficulty, the farmer will have to apply different measures or step up the effort a little bit according to the difficulties. So I think that this table gives you a first idea of the types of farmers or types of farms where in some cases it'll be easy for farmers to implement these measures, where they won't need so much assistance, so much help. And also, if you look at the cost of implementation towards the top there is not so high. And if you look at these measures, I think in terms of reduction or mitigation potential, there are two that stand out. Nitrogen balance, that's one thing. And then the measure that we suggested also to these farms with agri-environment measures, in particular low carbon AEMs, which is something we've advocated for them. Then there's a second category, if you like, second group. And here we're talking about manure, storage thereof, and also photovoltaic panels, so solar panels. That again is easy to implement. However, it's very costly. That's the downside, if you like. Implementation is very costly. So that's for manure storage and photovoltaic installation. And also, on a more ambitious scale, if you want to bring down GHG in farming or at farm level, there are three other measures I would mention. Cover crops for conservation measures, and that's mentioned specifically in our report, and also biogas for farms or at farm level. Here we're talking about animal waste being used for better purposes. There's a fairly important mitigation effect that can be achieved thanks to these kinds of measures. However, I would also point out that these particular measures are rather complex in terms of implementation, so you would have to make quite an effort in order to use those measures. Thank you. Now, I come to the conclusions of our study. First of all, it's an opportunity for us to draw your attention to this potential when it comes to reducing GHG emissions, anything between 10 and 40% in terms of reductions, depending on the farm. So, as you can see, there can be significant progress at farm level, and the farms that took part in our study did demonstrate such results. Also, there's a mention of what can be done in the EU, at EU level, within the farming sector. I think that these mitigation measures could be very advantageous, and there were two in particular that we would like to highlight. The balance, fertilizer balance, and also, of course, an AEM that would involve the farmer, helping that farmer reduce his GHG emissions. I think that these are important elements in terms of reduction potential. Now, there were all sorts of environmental impacts and environmental issues. We didn't necessarily analyse them all in detail, but what we did find is that there is significant synergy that can be derived from all this. For instance, water quality is a good example, or biodiversity. There's an awful lot of synergy that could actually be derived from all of this. And then in terms of the measures that we would like to advocate before you, if we want to make real progress in terms of the implementation of the CAP, we have to make sure that we have clear, precise definitions, and that's what we talk about when we refer to our future instruments, so that we can really derive the benefits that we're hoping for here. Thank you so much for your attention. And obviously we are at your disposal should you have any questions. Thank you.